You've been carrying too much for too long, old pain, hidden anger, that quiet sadness you never talk about. They told you to just move on, to stay positive, to let it go, but no one told you how. So you smile in public, but feel heavy in private. You're tired of pretending, tired of the racing thoughts, tired of waking up with that same tight feeling in your chest. But what if I told you, you don't have to stay stuck? That deep peace, the kind that softens your soul and resets your heart, it's not a myth. It's not just for monks in mountains. It's real, and it's closer than you think. Buddhist wisdom isn't about religion or rules. It's about freedom from fear, from chaos, from emotional pain. For thousands of years, these teachings have helped people quiet their minds, heal their hearts, and come home to themselves. And now they're here for you. Tonight, as you listen to these peaceful teachings, something inside you will start to shift. Your thoughts will slow down. The weight you've been carrying will start to melt. You'll feel still, clear, free. This isn't just another calming background noise. This is your emotional reset. 3 hours of ancient wisdom, spoken straight to your soul, not to escape life, but to finally live it, fully, gently, deeply. Are you ready to come home to yourself? Let's begin. You've heard the noise for so long, you stopped noticing it. The mental noise, the emotional static, the endless inner commentary, whispering what you should have said, what you should have done, what they might be thinking. You scroll, you click, you fill every second and still feel restless, still feel like something's missing. Not more content, not more input, but space, stillness, silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that heals, that holds you, that helps you breathe again. Silence isn't empty, it's full of answers. And the ancient Buddhists knew this long before science ever caught up. They called it mauna. Not just the absence of speech, but the presence of presence. Spiritual silence. The kind that doesn't just quiet the mouth, but quiets the storm inside. A silence that doesn't suppress emotion, but helps it unfold and dissolve, like ink fading into water. The world teaches us to speak louder to be heard, but Mauna teaches us the opposite, to be so inwardly still, so aware, that we no longer need to speak to be understood. And when practiced fully, Mauna becomes more than a break from talking. It becomes medicine for the nervous system, for the heart, for the parts of you that words can't touch. In Buddhist monasteries, silence isn't punishment, it's sanctuary. It resets the nervous system by shifting your attention from reaction to observation, from noise to nuance. When the mouth stops moving, body starts whispering. Your shoulders reveal the stress they've been holding. Your chest shows how long it, 39's, been constricted. Your jaw tells you how often you clench it when no one, 39's, looking. What you begin to feel once the external world goes quiet is the internal one waking up. Silence trains you to see what's really going on, not just outside, but inside. Thoughts become clearer. Not because they stop, but because they no longer tangle. They start to float, and in that float you can watch them without grabbing onto them. You start to notice patterns, the ones that always lead to anxiety, the ones that always spiral into guilt. And with time, you stop feeding them. You stop reacting to every thought like it's the truth. You start observing like a witness rather than jumping in as the actor. This shift, this step back is subtle, but it changes everything. Silence also resets emotional clarity. Emotions are waves, but most people interrupt the wave halfway. We talk over it, think through it, distract ourselves, suppress it. But when you stop and stay in silence, the emotion completes its cycle. It rises, it peaks, and it falls, without needing to be fixed, just felt. This emotional resolution, letting the wave, finishes what most of us are starving for, but it can't happen when we're always jumping from one input to the next. Silence gives you the space to actually feel, not just react. And feeling fully is how you heal fully. There's also a deeper layer, one most people don't even know they're missing. When you stay in silence long enough, something else starts to rise. Beneath the pain, beneath the stories, beneath the emotional dust, you find clarity. Not dramatic insight, but simple knowing. A sense that you've always known the truth. You just couldn't hear it over the noise. That's the gift of spiritual silence. It doesn't give you something new. It helps you remember what's always been there. Like a pond that settles after being stirred, your mind begins to reflect things clearly, without distortion. You start making decisions from calm, speaking from truth, showing up with less fear, less defense, less of the mask. Silence teaches you not to fear your own mind. In a world where every pause is filled and every emotion is labeled, that's radical. There's a reason monks spend days, even years, in silence, not to escape the world, but to become fluent in it, to see it without filters, to feel it without confusion. Silence sharpens perception. You begin to hear the tone behind the words, sense the emotion behind the behavior. You become a better listener, not just to others, but to yourself. You start catching the micro shifts, the moment before your anger rises, the flash of fear before the lie, the sadness behind the smile. These are the things that silence reveals, and once seen, they can be softened, redirected, healed. When the nervous system calms, the body starts healing too. Chronic tension begins to unwind. Muscles release, breathing deepens, cortisol lowers, heart rate balances. You move from survival mode to safety, from defense to openness, from hiding to showing up. And here's the part people forget. Silence isn't passive, it's active surrender. It takes courage to stop speaking, to stop explaining, to stop performing. It takes even more courage to listen to what comes up when you do. But if you stay with it, it gives you back something the world can't. Inner authority. The kind of inner authority that no compliment can boost and no insult can shake. And slowly, your relationships change too. You stop talking just to fill space. You become more intentional, more present. You speak when it matters and listen when it doesn't. You give others the gift of space. You stop jumping in to fix. You stop needing to control. That quiet confidence becomes magnetic. People feel safer around you not because you say the right things, but because your energy speaks louder than your words ever could. There's also an energy cost most of us don't realize we're paying until we stop. Talking burns energy. Constant expression, especially emotional expression without clarity, drains the nervous system. But silence restores it. Like plugging back into a deeper source, you feel nourished, not from outside. Validation, but from within. This is why silence is part of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, not just as a lifestyle, but as liberation. Right speech begins with right silence. When you know the weight of words, you start using them like medicine, not weapons. You speak less, but mean more. And when you fall silent, it's not emptiness, it's wisdom. Silence also shows you how noisy your mind really is. And that's not a failure, it's the beginning. Once you see the noise, you stop identifying with it. You stop believing every thought is you. Instead, you see them as visitors. They come, they stay, they leave. You don't have to invite them in for tea. This shift, this inner detachment, creates emotional clarity like nothing else. Suddenly, you don't spiral over every fear. You don't chase every craving. You sit, you breathe, you feel, and you let it pass. That's what healing looks like. Silence teaches you that urgency is often false, that you don't have to answer every message, solve every problem, prove your worth, that it's okay to be still, to not have an opinion, to not explain your pain. In fact, some wounds don't need to be spoken about, they just need to be held, and silence is the most honest way to hold something sacred. Not everything is meant to be shared. Some truths become diluted when turned into words, and some clarity only arises when you stop searching and start listening to the space between thoughts. That's where intuition lives. That's where wisdom rests. And over time, you start trusting yourself more, not because someone told you to, but because in silence, you heard yourself clearly. You felt your truth without the pressure to make it pretty. You no longer need to overthink your choices. You start recognizing what feels heavy and what feels light, what aligns and what doesn't. And that kind of knowing, silent, rooted, wordless is what people spend lifetimes looking for. We live in a culture that rewards noise. Noise in productivity, noise in self-promotion, noise in opinions. But peace doesn't live there. Peace isn't something you win, it's something you return to, and Morna is the path back. You might start with just 5 minutes a day. No talking, no music, no phone, just presence. At first, it might feel uncomfortable. Your thoughts might get louder before they quiet down. That's okay. That's normal. Don't run. Stay. Let the stillness do its work. Because the truth is, silence isn't silent at all. It speaks, it teaches, it heals. It tells you what your body has been trying to say for years. That you're tired, that you're carrying too much, that it's time to let go. It shows you that clarity doesn't always come from thinking harder, but from thinking less, from making space, from softening the grip. And somewhere in that space, you find your center again. Not the version of you shaped by fear or urgency or expectation, but the version that's always been there. Calm, clear, kind, awake. This is why silence isn't just peaceful, it's powerful. It's where you meet yourself without distortion, where you dissolve old patterns without force, where you step out of the storm without needing to outrun it. When practiced with intention, Mauna is not just a break from speaking, it's a reunion with your own wisdom, with your own peace, with a self that doesn't need approval to feel whole. And slowly, your life begins to change, not through effort, but through alignment. You start surrounding yourself with people who respect your quiet. You seek experiences that feed your spirit, not your ego. You stop needing to prove anything and just live, fully, softly, truthfully. Silence becomes your sanctuary, your medicine, your teacher, and one day, without even noticing, you'll wake up feeling lighter, not because life got easier, but because you stopped carrying so much noise. You started trusting the voice that doesn't speak, the one that's always known the way home. And now you, 39, re-listening. And just like that, silence brings you back to yourself. Not in theory, but in presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need fixing, changing, or explaining. The kind that sees clearly, breathes fully, and accepts reality as it is. But there's something else waiting under that quiet. Something most people avoid without realizing. Pain. Not loud pain, not dramatic pain, deeper pain. The one you carry quietly, the one that hides beneath your strength. The ache of what you've lost, the weight of what never healed. The emotions you buried to survive. And this is where the real work begins. Because silence doesn't erase suffering, it brings it into focus. But Buddhism doesn't ask you to run from it. It invites you to face it. And not just face it, but transform it. That's the alchemy, the ancient, sacred turning of something heavy into something healing. Dukkha is the word. Emotional pain, discomfort, dissatisfaction. It's not just grief or trauma. It's that subtle sense of unrest, the tightness in the chest when things go wrong, the low hum of longing when something's missing, the quiet frustration when life doesn't match the picture in your mind. Most people try to escape dukkha through distraction, through denial, through trying to fix everything outside themselves. But Buddhism flips the script. It teaches that suffering isn't a mistake. It's a messenger. And if you listen to it, really listen, it becomes your teacher, not to punish you, but to guide you. Every emotional wound holds the seeds of wisdom, but only if you stop trying to get rid of it long enough to hear what it's trying to say. Transformation doesn't begin when the pain stops. It begins when you stop resisting it, when you stop treating sadness like a problem, when you stop treating grief like a weakness, when you stop trying to numb anger and start understanding it instead. Pain doesn't want to hurt you. It wants to show you where you're not aligned, where you've abandoned yourself, where you still need to heal. And once you understand this, your relationship with suffering changes. You stop seeing it as a failure. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What is this here to teach me?" That shift is everything. Because now, instead of hiding from your wounds, you start working with them. You stop blaming the protease wounds world for what you feel. You begin to see that every emotional trigger is a doorway, a chance to meet a part of yourself that's still waiting for your attention. Dukkha becomes a path, a practice, a portal. Through the lens of Buddhist teachings, suffering isn't about punishment or karma catching up to you. It's about friction, the friction between what ice and what your mind insists should be. That friction causes pain, but the pain points you to where you, 39, still clinging to control, clinging to perfection, clinging to the past. And that's where the alchemy starts. You bring awareness into the exact place where you want to run. You turn toward what hurts without trying to fix it. You hold the fear. You sit with the shame. You allow the anger to breathe, and in that honest space, something shifts. Compassion rises, not as a concept, but as a force. Real compassion isn't about being nice. It's about seeing clearly. And when you see your pain without judgment, you start seeing everyone else's pain differently too. You stop reacting to people's outbursts. You begin to recognize that their cruelty is often a mask for their own wounds, that their coldness comes from their own freezing inside, that their walls are the result of their own broken trust. This kind of seeing gives you power. Not power over others, but power to respond from love instead of fear. to stay grounded when others are reactive, to hold space instead of lashing out. Because you've met your own darkness, you've walked through it, you've made peace with it. And that journey builds a strength nothing outside you can touch. This is what the Buddha meant by liberation, not the end of hardship, but the end of being controlled by it. The freedom to feel everything without being consumed by it. The power to use suffering as fuel, not as chains. Because when you stop fighting your pain, it starts guiding you. It softens you. It teaches you empathy, not just for others, but for the parts of yourself you used to reject. And this is important because you can't fully love others until you've stopped hating parts of yourself. You can't offer deep compassion if you're still shaming your own sadness. But when you hold your emotional pain with patience, with care, it changes texture. The sharpness softens, the heat cools. What once felt unbearable becomes understandable, and what's understandable becomes transformable. This is emotional transmutation, taking the raw energy of pain and giving it new direction. Like fire that used to burn now becoming light, like a wound that used to define you becoming a scar that teaches. The hurt doesn't disappear, but it doesn't hurt in the same way. It becomes part of your wholeness, not something you hide, but something you honor. And with time, you start trusting this process. You stop fearing hard emotions. You stop reacting to discomfort with panic. You begin to see sadness as a sign of depth, anger as a signal for boundaries, anxiety as a messenger for unmet needs. You stop labeling emotions as good or bad. You start listening instead. Listening for what each one is trying to protect, what each one is trying to heal. That's the compassion inside dukkha. It reveals what matters to you. You wouldn't grieve if you didn't love. You wouldn't get angry if you didn't care. You wouldn't feel anxious if you didn't crave safety. Pain doesn't make you broken. It makes you human, and being human is sacred. In Buddhist practice, this transformation is not forced. It's allowed. You don't rush the pain. You don't bypass it. You give it space. You let it unfold in its own rhythm. You sit with it the way a monk sits with breath, gently, consistently, with patience. And in that stillness, healing happens. Not always quickly, not always visibly, but deeply, quietly, steadily. And eventually, you begin to notice the shifts. You don't react to criticism like you used to. You don't spiral when plans fall apart. You don't carry resentment for days. It's not that you feel less, it's that you've built capacity to hold what you feel. Your nervous system becomes more resilient. Your mind becomes clearer. Your heart becomes stronger. And this changes how you show up in the world. You become less defensive, more present, less focused on fixing others, and more focused on understanding them. You stop needing people to behave a certain way in order for you to feel okay. You stop tying your worth to things you can't control. That's real freedom. And it starts with embracing your own suffering as sacred material. The Buddha didn't promise a life without dukkha. He promised a path through it. And this path isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. Sometimes you revisit old pain, sometimes it flares up, but each time you meet it with more awareness, more skill, more compassion. And with each return, you suffer less, because you're no longer resisting it. This is the heart of Buddhist transmutation, turning reaction into reflection, turning contraction into expansion, turning suffering into strength, not the rigid kind, but the kind that holds both joy and sorrow without crumbling. And here's the truth most people miss. The deeper you go into your pain, the more capacity you have for joy, real joy. Not the surface kind, but the kind that doesn't need circumstances to be perfect. The kind that flows from presence, from connection, from peace with your own heart. This isn't just emotional maturity, it's spiritual evolution, and you don't need to retreat to a monastery to find it. You find it in daily life, in the pauses between arguments, in the stillness after crying, in the pauses choice to stay with your discomfort instead of running from it. That's where the gold is. That's the alchemy. The world may keep telling you to just be happy, to avoid pain, to stay positive no matter what. But Buddhist wisdom whispers something more honest, more human. Feel everything. Let it teach you, and then let it go. That's how you rise, not by avoiding the fire, but by walking through it with grace. And eventually, you become a source of light for others, not because you have all the answers, but because you're no longer afraid of the darkness. You become someone who can hold space for pain without rushing to fix it. Someone who can sit with discomfort without turning away. Someone who loves from depth, not from fear. And this is how emotional pain becomes compassionate power. Not power over people, but power to meet them exactly where they are. Power to forgive without forgetting. Power to speak with clarity and act with wisdom. Power to be soft without collapsing, strong without hardening, steady without becoming numb. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens choice by choice, breath by breath. Every time you choose to feel instead of flee. Every time you meet yourself with kindness instead of judgment. Every time you pause and say, "This too belongs." That's the quiet revolution of Buddhist alchemy. It doesn't shout, it doesn't sparkle, but it changes everything. And now your journey continues, deeper, wiser, braver, not away from suffering, but through it, and through it into freedom. When you stop resisting your pain and begin listening to it, you learn that your suffering is not a sign of weakness, it's a doorway to strength. But there's still one question left hanging quietly in the air, a deeper layer beneath all the emotion, beneath even the compassion you've started to cultivate. Who is it that's suffering? Who is this you who carries the grief, who holds the anger, who fears rejection or clings to praise? That question, left unasked, is the root of nearly all emotional pain. And the moment you dare to look at it clearly, everything starts to shift. What if the version of you that suffers the most, the one that feels broken, betrayed, inadequate, is not the real you, not a lie, but not solid either, just a temporary construction made of memories, habits, opinions, and stories passed down like heirlooms? The teaching of anatta, or non-self, breaks the illusion that this identity you carry is a fixed, unchanging truth. In reality, it's a flowing process, not a thing, a verb, not a noun. Most emotional suffering arises when we grip tightly to a sense of me, my story, my failure, my worth, my wound. But the more we hold on to this self-image, the more fragile and defensive we become. We build an identity out of old pain and then live our lives protecting it. Every insult cuts deeper, every loss feels personal, every mistake becomes shame, not simply feedback. And yet, when you begin to loosen that grip, not by erasing your humanity, but by questioning your assumptions, something opens. A kind of emotional spaciousness begins to form. You start to see that the self you defend so fiercely is always changing. The thoughts you believed yesterday are different from today. The emotions that seemed permanent last year have already faded. The preferences, the desires, the fears all shifting. If the self keeps changing, how can it be fixed? If the self is a process, not a possession, why are we so afraid to let it go? This is the heart of anatta. It's not saying you don't exist. It's saying you don't exist the way you think. You do. And this realization, when embodied, is deeply freeing, because once you stop treating identity as a solid object, you stop taking every emotional wound as a permanent scar. You start seeing emotions not as attacks on who you are, but as waves moving through the open field of awareness. There's pain, but there's no one fixed in that pain. There's anger, but there's no fixed self that is angry forever. This changes your relationship with emotional triggers. Someone criticizes you, and the old pattern of defense starts to rise. But now, you notice it. You don't immediately grab onto the thought, "They're attacking me." You start to observe there's a sensation of defensiveness. That shift from identification to observation creates space. Space for response, space for reflection, space for peace. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It's clarity. You begin to see your thoughts as clouds passing through the sky, not as truths carved in stone. You notice how certain beliefs about yourself trigger anxiety, while others bring temporary relief. You see how often you replay stories of failure or unworthiness, and slowly you begin to ask, if I am not these stories, who am I? That's where the liberation begins. Because when you stop defining yourself by the stories of your past, you stop carrying their emotional weight. You don't forget your experiences, but you stop living through them. You let go of the need to keep proving or defending a version of yourself. You start resting in what's real right now, this moment, this breath, this awareness. And from here, something profound starts to unfold. When the fixation on me softens, compassion for others grows naturally. Why? Because when you see that your pain wasn't personal, you begin to see that other people's actions aren't personal either. The person who yelled at you wasn't attacking you, they were reacting from their own conditioning. The betrayal you felt wasn't because you're unworthy, it was because someone else was lost in their own pain. This shift dismantles resentment, not because you excuse harmful behavior, but because you no longer build your identity around the wound. You begin to understand that most emotional harm doesn't come from others alone, it comes from how tightly we cling to the belief, this happened to me, therefore I am this kind of person. Once that belief loosens, healing flows. The illusion of a solid self also creates fear of change. We cling to labels because they make us feel secure. But the truth is, identity becomes a prison when we refuse to evolve. Anatta opens the door to Daimor to En, fluidity. You stop needing to be consistent in a rigid way. You allow yourself to grow, to contradict, to outgrow patterns that once defined you. And that adaptability is a form of emotional resilience. You no longer panic when old feelings rise. You no longer shrink under the weight of shame. You know, these states aren't permanent. They're weather, not architecture. They pass. And in that passing, you return to a deeper home, not the self you constructed, but the awareness that holds it all. And what is that awareness? In Buddhism, it is not a self in disguise. It is clarity, presence, a knowing that doesn't cling, a seeing that doesn't grab. And from that place, you respond to life with greater gentleness. You don't have to harden when you're misunderstood. You don't have to inflate when You're praised, you stay centered, not because you're avoiding emotion, but because you're no longer identified with every thought and feeling that arises. This kind of inner stability leads to deep emotional freedom. When you're no longer entangled with a fixed identity, life becomes lighter. You can laugh at your mistakes. You can cry without shame. You can express yourself without fear of contradiction. There's a natural honesty that emerges when you don't need to be anyone in particular. Relationships begin to transform as well. You stop needing others to reflect back a certain image of you. You listen more. You defend less. You become curious instead of controlling. Because when your identity isn't on the line, you're free to be present. You can hold space for difference. You can forgive more easily because your ego isn't absorbing every slight like an open wound. And this has a ripple effect. Your calm becomes a mirror. Your openness becomes an invitation. You stop feeding conflict with reactivity. You start disarming tension with presence, and not by force, but by resting in the simplicity of being. The less you carry the burden of identity, the more energy you have to care, to serve, to love. This understanding also breaks the cycle of seeking. So much suffering comes from trying to become someone better, more successful, more liked, more spiritual. But when you see through the breeze, illusion of a fixed self, you stop chasing versions of yourself that don't exist. You start living from presence instead of performance. And presence brings peace. You're not trying to fix every flaw. You're not constantly adjusting your mask. You're just here, aware, alive. And in that presence, joy arises. Not the kind that depends on circumstances, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from not needing anything extra to feel complete. This is not about erasing personality or becoming passive. It's about seeing that your personality is a fluid expression, not a fixed identity. It's about knowing that who you are is not limited to your thoughts or history. And when you stop believing that you are your pain, your past, your labels, you step into a new kind of freedom without edges. This shift also allows for emotional healing on a subtle level. Often, emotional wounds stay stuck because they're tied to identity. I'm someone who always gets abandoned. I'm someone who's never enough. These identities trap the pain. But when you question the identity, the wound has room to move. You can still feel grief, but it doesn't define you. You can still face fear, but it doesn't shape your self-worth. You begin to live from awareness, not from history. And awareness doesn't need a story to exist. It just is. And that just is-ness becomes your ground, stable, clear, open. This is the liberation anatta offers, not through force or denial, but through understanding. A gentle undoing of everything that keeps you bound. A return to what's always been here, the awareness. Underneath every experience, the presence that holds every emotion, the stillness beneath every movement. When you live from that place, emotions still arise, but they flow through you, not into you. They don't stick, they don't define, they visit and they leave, and in between you rest in something quiet, something whole. That is emotional liberation, not the end of feeling, but the end of being held hostage by the idea of who you think you are. And in that letting go, you find something more real than identity. You find peace. And not the kind that needs to be earned, but the kind that was always yours. All you had to do was stop gripping the illusion long enough to feel it. When identity softens, clarity enters. No longer chained to labels or past stories, the mind begins to notice what was always there but rarely seen. the subtle energies flowing beneath thought, not the loud narratives or emotional outbursts, but the quiet tones, the textures, the flavors of the mind itself. And these flavors matter because they shape how we feel, how we act, and ultimately who we become. Some thoughts build peace, others quietly poison it. The difference is rarely obvious. That's why so many fall into suffering without knowing why. The Buddha offered a map, not just to understand thought, but to feel its moral weight, its energy, its consequence. He called it kusala and akusala, two paths, two qualities. One leads to clarity, the other to confusion. One opens the heart, the other clouds it. This isn't about morality in the way we usually think of it. It's about alignment, mental hygiene, emotional integrity. Kusala refers to thoughts, intentions, and actions that are skillful, meaning they come from a place of wisdom, balance, and compassion. They lead to well-being, not just for others, but for you. They uplift the mind. They don't leave a bitter residue. Akusala, by contrast, refers to unskillful states, not bad in a moral sense, but unwholesome, rooted in greed, hatred, or delusion. These thoughts may feel powerful in the moment, justified, righteous, seductive, but they always leave you more tangled, more reactive, more drained. To see this clearly is to take full emotional responsibility for the state of your inner world. Not blame, not guilt, just honest noticing. When you begin to watch your mind this way, you stop reacting to life automatically. You learn to pause, to assess not just the content of your thoughts, but their quality, their scent, their direction. A thought about your future may seem logical, but is it coming from grounded care or anxious control? A comment you want to make may be true, but is it rooted in kindness or in the need to win? A choice you're about to make may seem harmless, but is it echoing fear or love? This level of self-inquiry takes practice. It's not about overanalyzing every mental event. It's about tuning in, feeling the energy of a thought, the way you feel the atmosphere of a room. Some thoughts expand your breath, others contract it. Some thoughts bring your shoulders down, others raise your heart rate. The body often knows before the intellect does. Skillful mental states, those that lead toward kusalakari calm, they create inner space. They feel complete even before any action is taken. There is a sense of rightness that doesn't need validation. You feel connected to truth, to care, to balance. These thoughts don't escalate emotional pain. They help integrate it. They don't spike judgment. They invite understanding. Unskillful states, akusala, tend to rush. They have a pushing quality, a pressure behind them. They often come dressed as urgency, masked as logic, wrapped in emotional reactivity. But underneath there is disconnection, a pulling away from clarity. These thoughts spiral, they loop, they convince you of danger when none exists. And worst of all, they feel familiar, because they've been rehearsed for years. This is why training the mind to distinguish the two is so essential. Without this discernment, we act out of habit. We speak from wounds. We respond from fear. We create stories that harm our peace. But when we build the habit of noticing not just what we're thinking, but how those thoughts feel in the nervous system, everything changes. This is not a rejection of hard feelings. It's a refinement of awareness. Acknowledging anger is healthy. Feeding it with narratives that inflame it is not. Feeling grief is human. Letting it collapse your sense of worth is unskillful. The goal is not to become perfect or robotic. It's to become discerning, to know when you're moving from love and when you're moving from lack. The Buddha taught that every moment is a fork in the road. Every thought is a seed. It will either bloom into more confusion or into more peace. And often, the difference is subtle. A thought of wanting to help can be skillfuler. It can come from needing to fix in order to feel valuable. A desire to speak the truth can be skillfuler. It can come from needing to dominate. The shift is not always in the action, but in the energy behind it. That energy becomes easier to feel the more present you are. That's why mindfulness matters, not just to reduce stress, but to become intimate with your own inner life. The more you sit with the breath, the more you notice the push and pull of your thoughts. The more you catch the moment a craving forms. The more you sense the contraction when judgment arises. And in that awareness, you have choice. Choice is power. The power to pause. The power to question. The power to not follow every thought that knocks on your door. That's emotional hygiene. And like physical hygiene, it's not a one-time event. It's a daily tending, a quiet discipline of checking in with your mental state before you let it spill into speech or action. This practice builds emotional maturity. You stop being a slave to your moods. You stop blaming others for your reactions. You learn to trace the emotional experience back to its root, often a small, unnoticed thought that was never questioned. You begin to take full ownership of your inner state, without shame, without denial. And from this foundation, you grow compassion, not as a forced virtue, but as a natural result of clarity. Because when you recognize how often your own mind wanders into unskillful states, you become less reactive when others do too. You stop expecting perfection. You start seeing the shared struggle, the shared messiness. And you respond not with enabling, but with presence. This also frees you from false confidence, because even thoughts that sound wise can be unskillful if they feed the ego. Even spiritual insights can become ego traps if they aren't rooted in humility. Kusala is not about appearing good. It's about moving in harmony with what uplifts and supports clarity. It's not performative, it's embodied. And this discernment becomes your inner compass. You no longer need to ask others constantly what's right. You feel it. You sense when something is aligned or not. Not based on fear of consequences, but based on energetic integrity. You start trusting your inner knowing, not because it always tells you what you want, but because it tells you what brings real peace. This is where discipline meets freedom, because the more you commit to choosing skillful states, the more spacious your inner world becomes. You're no longer dragged by every passing mood. You're no longer hijacked by every thought. You hold yourself with steadiness, with clarity, with care. And over time, your default settings begin to shift. The grooves of the mind change. The thoughts that used to dominate begin to fade. The reactions that once felt automatic slow down. You find yourself choosing kindness more often, not out of effort, but out of ease. You speak more truth, not because you should, but because it feels clean. That's the power of mental training. It reconditions the mind, not through suppression, but through redirection. Not through force, but through awareness. You meet each thought with a quiet question. Is this skillful? Does this support peace? Does this align with my deepest values? This inquiry doesn't turn you into a moralist. It turns you into someone who respects their inner world. Someone who cares enough about their own well-being to not feed the thoughts that erode it. Someone who begins to see thoughts not as facts, but as suggestions. And not all suggestions are helpful. The mind, untrained, is wild, but the mind, observed, becomes a source of wisdom. When you pay attention, you learn what nourishes you and what drains you. You learn the difference between inspiration and impulse, between insight and insecurity, between love and attachment. And slowly, you begin to live more from kusala, not because you're chasing virtue, but because unskillful states simply lose their grip. You feel how heavy they are, how much noise they make, how little they offer, and you let them pass, not with judgment, not with fear, but with peace. This is not perfection, it's practice, a lifelong path of tending to your mind with the same care you offer a beloved child, patient, curious, compassionate. You forgive yourself when you forget. You begin again when you fall. And with each return, you strengthen the muscle of discernment. Because at the end of the day, the quality of your life is shaped by the quality of your thoughts. Not just the ones you notice, but the ones you entertain, the ones you believe, the ones you repeat. Every moment of awareness is a chance to choose skillfulness over reactivity, presence over habit, peace over drama. And it starts with one simple question, whispered in the silence between thoughts. Is this useful? Is this kind? Is this true? That's the doorway. Walk through it, and you'll find a mind that no longer drags you around but walks beside you, steady and clear. As the mind begins to quiet and you learn to recognize the texture of thoughts, something deeper begins to stir. Body speaks. It doesn't. 39. Et use words, but it never lies. While thoughts rise and pass quickly, the body holds what the mind can't process. Emotional residue lives in posture, in tension, in breath. And yet, we often overlook it. We chase clarity in silence and stillness, but forget the power of motion. That's where the next layer of awareness lives, not just in sitting, but in walking. A slow, deliberate step becomes a doorway to see your inner world from a different angle. Walking meditation is not exercise. It's not about reaching a destination or getting the heart rate up. It's a way to train attention using movement, a practice that reveals what stillness sometimes hides. When the body moves with presence, emotions surface gently. You start to notice what you carry without force, without judgment. This method is one of the most overlooked yet profound tools in Buddhist practice. It brings the mind down into the feet, into the legs, into the ground. It grounds thought. It slows down reaction. It gives rhythm to reflection. Each step becomes a mirror. You notice how your weight shifts, how your pace speeds up when you 39 anxious, how your feet drag when you 39 avoiding something, how tension pools in the hips when anger is present. These are not metaphors, they are patterns, real, lived experiences that appear through movement, and by paying attention, you begin to read them clearly. Mindful walking gives you access to a different form of intelligence-embodied insight. You are no longer just watching your thoughts from the outside. You are experiencing them as sensations, as patterns of breath and balance. And this teaches you something that stillness cannot: how to carry mindfulness into life, into motion, into the places where things aren't quiet. When you walk slowly, with full awareness, you give your nervous system time to catch up with your mind. Most people move through life too fast for their emotions to be digested. They're 5 steps ahead, of their feelings, but walking meditation corrects that. It forces a slower rhythm, one where you can track your emotional weather in real time, where the act of stepping becomes a form of listening. And with that listening comes clarity. Not dramatic realization, just small, steady shifts. You might feel a tightness in the chest that wasn't 39T obvious before, a habit of clenching your jaw, a recurring thought that always appears when you cross a certain threshold. These are signals. And when you walk with attention, you're not just noticing them, you're letting them move through. The body naturally processes emotion when we stop interfering. Walking helps this. It gives the mind just enough to do so the deeper patterns can surface. You, 39, not trying to solve anything. You, 39, simply witnessing how your inner world unfolds, step by step. And in this process, something opens, emotional. Patterns that felt stuck begin to loosen. They begin to move. And over time, they begin to dissolve. What you're learning is emotional literacy, not through analysis, but through rhythm. Every footstep becomes a punctuation mark in the inner dialogue. You begin to notice how your thoughts influence your steps, how your mood shapes your posture. And with this awareness, choice returns. You can slow down when anger pushes. You can breathe when fear closes in. You can soften the body even when the heart feels hard. This is what makes walking meditation a practice of integration. It brings the insight of stillness into the world of action. It allows you to stay grounded even when things move. It trains the nervous system to regulate under motion. And this has powerful effects in daily life. When stress rises, you don't immediately react. You've trained yourself to observe. When conflict appears, you're less likely to tighten. You've learned to stay present in the body. This presence changes how you relate to emotion. You stop treating it like a threat. You start feeling it as energy, not identity. Sadness becomes something that moves through the spine, not something that defines your worth. Frustration becomes a tightening in the calves, not a sign of failure. These shifts are subtle, but over time, they create a new relationship with your emotional landscape. The body becomes your ally, not just a vehicle. It becomes a partner in awareness. You feel your weight as it shifts. You hear the sounds around you. You notice how the environment affects your inner state. A certain path might bring up old memories. A corner might tighten your breath. These cues were always there, you just weren't tuned to them. Walking meditation tunes you. It refines your instrument. It teaches you that presence is portable, that you don't need silence to be mindful, that every step can be sacred, every breath can be a reset. You begin to use walking not to get somewhere, but to return to yourself. And this return is healing, especially when emotion feels too big to sit with. Some pain is too dense to hold still, but it softens with motion. Walking creates just enough movement for the nervous system to stay open. It gives fear a way to flow out. It gives grief a rhythm to follow. It gives anger a path to unwind. These are not techniques, they're truths rooted in practice. You also begin to realize that emotion isn't static. It moves in cycles. And when you walk with awareness, you can track these cycles. You see how sadness rises, stays, and then fades. You feel how irritation pulses, then softens. This tracking creates confidence. You learn that no state lasts forever. That emotional storms, like weather, always pass if you don't hold on to them. And walking teaches you to not hold, not by suppressing, but by allowing, by letting each step carry something away, by trusting that the earth can hold what you release, that your body knows how to reset if you let it. Over time, walking meditation strengthens your resilience. You no longer fear discomfort. You meet it. You walk with it. You learn its rhythm. And in that companionship, you begin to understand something vital, that healing doesn't mean erasing pain. It means learning to move with it, to carry it without collapse, to stay open in the presence of heaviness. This doesn't make you detached, it makes you steady. You start navigating life with more grace. You become less reactive, more reflective. You don't run from discomfort, you walk through it. With attention, with care, with patience. And in this practice, you find simplicity. No tools, no devices. Just your body, your breath, your presence. It's enough. It's always been enough. This is what the Buddha taught, that liberation is in this moment, in this body, in this awareness. Not after a retreat, not in some distant state, but right here, step by step by step. As your feet meet the ground, your mind learns to settle, your emotions learn to move, your heart learns to listen. You're not trying to become peaceful, you're becoming peace itself, not through control but through connection. Walking meditation reconnects you to your breath, to your steps, to your emotional truth. And in that reconnection, a deep kind of healing unfolds. Quiet, gentle, real. You don't need to chase insight. You don't need to force change. You just need to walk aware, alive, present. Let the body guide. Let the mind watch. Let the heart open. This is the path. This is the mirror. This is the way you come home, one step at a time. With each step taken in presence, something deep begins to settle. The noise quiets, the stories slow down. Awareness roots itself in the body. You feel more than thoughts now. You feel movements in your inner landscape that were hidden under distractions. But not everything that rises feels peaceful. Some emotions surface with weight. Some memories return with sharpness. They don't fit into the lightness we seek, yet they return because they were never truly gone. These are the hidden forces, unseen but powerful. This is where shadow work begins. In Buddhist tradition, there is a figure that represents these hidden forces, Mara, not as a demon of myth alone, but as a psychological truth. Mara is not a villain to defeat, but a mirror of the parts of ourselves we try to avoid. Fear, desire, self-doubt, jealousies are the forms Mara takes. And when left in the dark, they grow stronger. But when seen clearly, they begin to dissolve. That's the paradox. What we fear in ourselves loses power when we meet it face to face. Shadow work in this context is not dramatic confrontation, it's honest awareness. It's not about fighting the parts of yourself that feel ugly or unwanted. It's about recognizing that those parts exist because they were never given space. The inner Mara appears most when we suppress emotion, when we pretend not to feel what we actually do, when we shame ourselves into silence instead of listening with compassion. Fear is not the enemy. Fear becomes destructive when we don't allow it to be felt. Envy isn't poison by itself. It becomes harmful when we deny it and act from the shadows. Craving isn't inherently wrong, but when we identify with it and let it control us, it leads to suffering. These are the emotional archetypes of Mara, and the path isn't about banishing them, it's about integration. Integration means no longer splitting yourself into good and bad, worthy and unworthy. It means sitting with all aspects of your experience and asking, what is this part trying to protect? Because even your most difficult emotions began as strategies for survival. Fear tried to keep you safe. Craving tried to fill a space. Anger tried to give you power when you felt powerless. Once you see that, you can hold these parts with understanding rather than judgment. This shift is crucial. Many spiritual seekers try to bypass the shadow. They aim only for light, only for peace, only for love. But in doing so, they exile the very parts of themselves that need the most care. The shadow doesn't disappear because you meditate more. It waits. And when life shakes you, it returns, louder. But if you turn toward it, if you look with clear eyes and a soft heart, it begins to transform. Meeting the shadow doesn't mean indulging it. It means allowing it to be seen. When envy rises, can you acknowledge it without shame? Can you feel its burn without acting on it? That simple pause is powerful. That moment of clarity is the beginning of healing. You start to trace the root. Maybe it comes from feeling overlooked, from believing there's not enough, from forgetting your own worth. Once seen, you don't need to be ruled by it. Craving works the same way. The pull to have more, be more, get more. It doesn't need punishment. It needs attention. What are you avoiding when you reach for more? What emptiness are you trying to fill? Often, it's not about the thing itself. It's about a deeper longing for comfort, for connection, for meaning. When you sit with the craving and explore its layers, you no longer follow it blindly. You begin to respond rather than react. Fear is another mask Mara wears, and it is often the most persuasive. Fear tells stories that feel true. It paints futures that haven't happened. It tightens the breath and narrows the view. But fear isn't a problem until we let it define our choices. When we meet fear as a visitor rather than a voice of truth, we soften its hold. We ask, what is this fear pointing to? What wound has not been healed? What risk feels too big? In Buddhist teachings, even the Buddha was visited by Mara, not once, but many times, even after enlightenment. The point wasn't to destroy Mara, but to recognize him, to say, I see you, to sit with the discomfort without turning away. That's the teaching. Enlightenment doesn't erase difficulty, it changes how we relate to it. So in your own life, the question becomes, where does Mara visit you? In which moments do you feel the urge to hide, to perform, to control? These are the doorways to shadow work. These are the places where honesty becomes liberation. You're not looking for flaws to fix. You're building the capacity to hold what's true, even when it's hard. This work also brings humility. It shows you that no emotion is beneath you, that no thought defines you, that you are more than your best and your worst days, and that truth creates space for others. When you stop rejecting your own humanity, you stop demanding perfection from the people around you. You listen better. You judge less. You become a safe space for yourself and for others. That safety is healing, because much of the shadow was born in environments where emotion wasn't safe, where anger had to be hidden, where sadness was shamed, where vulnerability was punished. When you create a space now where all of you is welcome, you break the pattern. You stop passing the wound forward. You start writing a new story, one where truth is not a threat. Shadow work also strengthens your intuition, because once the noise of suppressed emotion quiets, you begin to hear your deeper knowing. You sense when something is off. You notice when you're acting from fear rather than wisdom. You recognize when old patterns are resurfacing. This awareness becomes your guide, not to avoid difficulty, but to move through it with clarity. And this movement brings energy back. Suppressing emotion is exhausting. Pretending to be someone, you, 39, not drains the spirit. When you reclaim those lost parts, when you bring them out of the shadow, you feel more whole, more alive. Not because life got easier, but because you stopped hiding from it. You also begin to feel compassion in new ways. Not just as a concept, but as a lived experience. You know what it's like to struggle with jealousy, to be afraid, to crave validation, and that knowing helps. You see others more gently. You no longer react to their masks. You recognize their pain beneath the surface, and that recognition is healing for both of you. The work doesn't end. Mara returns, sometimes in familiar forms, sometimes wearing new faces. But now you know the signs. You feel the contraction. You hear the story. And instead of collapsing into it, you pause, you acknowledge, you breathe, you let it pass. And if it doesn't pass quickly, you stay. You hold yourself through it, not with force, not with blame, but with patience. Because this is the path, not escape, not perfection, but presence, deep, unwavering. Presence with whatever arises. You don't need to fix your shadow, you need to know it. You need to see it clearly enough that it doesn't need to shout. When you stop making parts of yourself wrong, those parts stop sabotaging you. They become integrated, aligned. They give their energy back to the whole. That's the promise of this path, not that you'll never feel fear again, but that fear will no longer shape your identity. Not that craving disappears, but that it no longer leads your choices. Not that you never feel envy, but that it no longer blocks your joy. You move with these parts, not against them. And in that movement, you grow, not away from yourself, but deeper into yourself, into a version of you that is honest, aware, and whole. This is the liberation found in darkness, not from ignoring it, but from lighting a candle and sitting with it until the monsters become messengers. That's how you befriend the inner Mara, not through rejection, through recognition, through love, fierce enough to hold what hurts, through wisdom steady enough to see clearly, through presence deep enough to heal, and step by step, moment by moment, shadow becomes light, not because it changed, but because you did. When you stop rejecting your inner darkness and begin holding it with presence, something profound begins to shift. You no longer run from discomfort, you learn to meet it. You understand that the parts of you once tried to silence were never your enemies, they were guides. But even with this insight, there is a deeper layer that continues to surface, a pattern that seems to repeat. You notice how the same emotional pain keeps returning. Different people, different situations, but the same inner loop. You heal, and then you find yourself back in the same struggle, not because you failed, but because something deeper is trying to reveal itself. This is where the wisdom of samsara becomes essential, not as a doctrine of literal rebirth, but as a psychological and emotional map. Samsara is the cycle of birth and death, of rising and falling, of becoming and unraveling. In Buddhist teachings, it represents the wheel of suffer-engendless repetition, driven by craving, aversion, and ignorance. But on a personal level, it points to the patterns that govern our emotional lives, the loops we find ourselves trapped in again and again, without realizing how or why. Each time you react to pain with the same story, each time you chase validation through the same role, each time you fall into the same argument or fear or habit, you're experiencing a personal version of samsara. It's not just about what happens outside. It's about how you keep giving birth to the same experience internally, even after the outer conditions have changed. And until you recognize the cycle, you remain inside it, believing it. 39. Life when it's really just repetition. Awareness is what interrupts the loop. Not dramatic insight, but slow, steady seeing. You begin to trace the moments before the emotion peaks. You notice the sensation before the thought forms. You become sensitive to how your inner world reacts before your outer world does. And in that gap, you find choice. You're no longer spinning unconsciously, you're witnessing the pattern with clarity. This witnessing is not passive, it's the beginning of transformation. When you see how often your mind recreates the same reality, you begin to ask different questions. Not, how do I fix this? But, what is fueling this? The answer is often subtle. A belief formed in childhood, a fear of being abandoned, a need to feel significant. These emotional roots power the wheel of samsara, and once seen clearly, they begin to lose their grip. You start to understand how craving drives you into cycles. Not just material craving, but emotional. Craving the desire to feel loved, needed, admired, important. When this desire is unconscious, it creates behaviors that seek constant reassurance. You give too much. You sacrifice your truth. You chase connections that drain you. And when it collapses, you start again rebuilding the same illusion, hoping for a different outcome. Aversion plays a similar role. You avoid discomfort at all costs. You silence what's true to keep the peace. You shut down in conflict. You distract yourself from pain. But what you avoid grows stronger. And so the cycle continues, repeating until the avoidance becomes more painful than the feeling itself. Only then do you turn toward it. And when you do, the cycle starts to dissolve. Ignorance is the final thread, not stupidity, but unconsciousness. You act without knowing why. You say yes when you mean no. You perform roles that no longer reflect who you are. This kind of blindness keeps the wheel turning. It keeps you trapped in identities that were never yours to carry. The moment you begin to question, to pause, to feel, the light breaks through. You're no longer asleep in your own life. This is what rebirthing through samsara awareness means. Not leaving life, but waking up inside it. Not rejecting experience, but seeing it clearly enough to stop being consumed by it. You still feel. You still struggle. But now you have perspective. You understand that suffering often repeats not because you're broken, but because your awareness hasn't reached that part yet. You also realize that every cycle has a doorway. The pattern itself is not your prison, it's your teacher. The trigger that repeats is pointing somewhere. The emotion that floods you is guarding something. When you explore instead of resist, you begin to see the story behind the pattern, the identity it's trying to protect, the fear it's trying to avoid. And when that story is brought into the light, it begins to dissolve. The loop loosens, the energy shifts. And then something remarkable happens. You find that you no longer react in the same way. You pause before responding. You feel the old pattern rising, but you don't follow it. You stay with the discomfort, long enough to move through it instead of around it. This is liberation from the inside out. Not escape, but integration. Not perfection, but presence. This path is not about controlling life. It's about becoming more conscious inside it. You stop expecting people to change so you can feel safe. You stop needing circumstances to align for you to feel peace. You carry the awareness into every moment, and that awareness changes the outcome. You begin to live from a different center, not from fear or grasping, but from clarity. Samsara also teaches humility. You recognize that waking up is not a one-time event. It's a continuous return. You'll fall asleep again. You'll forget. You'll react. But each time, you remember more quickly. You see the loop sooner. You take responsibility more fully. And in that practice, you build strength. Not the brittle kind that denies pain, but the kind that can hold it without falling apart. This strength becomes your foundation. You no longer fear the hard moments. You know they carry insight. You don't seek constant ease. You value depth. You stop needing to feel good all the time. You start wanting to feel truth, even when it hurts, even when it disrupts the comfort of old roles. You also begin to sense the deeper rhythms of your own life, the seasons of emotion, the tides of energy. You no longer fight your cycles, you honor them. You give space to grief. You allow joy to rise without gripping. You recognize that every ending holds the seed of beginning, that every fall is part of the spiral upward. You stop needing constant forward motion. You find healing in stillness, in returning, in staying present with the cycle instead of trying to escape it. This awareness becomes compassion. You see others inside their own loops. You stop taking their behavior personally. You recognize their patterns as you recognize your own. You become less reactive, less judgmental, more steady, more kind, not because you've detached, but because you've seen the deeper truth. Everyone is moving through their own samsara. Most people are spinning without knowing it. When you step off your own wheel for a moment, you become a refuge. You stop feeding conflict. You hold space instead. You stop trying to fix people. You become a mirror of presence. That's powerful. That's healing, not only for you but for those around you. And slowly, you begin to sense another way of being. A life not ruled by reaction. A heart not shaped by the past. A mind not pulled by every craving or fear. You still live, you still feel, but you move with intention, with clarity, with compassion. This is not the end of samsara, the awakening within it. You begin to walk through life more consciously. You notice when old loops call your name. You smile when you recognize the familiar pull. And instead of falling back into the spiral, you breathe. You watch. You choose differently. And in that choice, you are reborn, not into a new identity, but into presence. This is the practice. This is the rebirth. Not through struggle, but through seeing. Not through resistance, but through release. You're not escaping life. You're entering it fully, awake, honest, free. The wheel of samsara may keep turning, but you are no longer asleep at its center. You are the awareness watching, the breath returning, the presence remembering. And that changes everything. When you stop living inside the cycle of unconscious reactions and begin to witness the rhythm of your emotional loops, something begins to shift, not just inside you, but in the way you relate to others. You no longer carry the same expectations. You stop needing life to be fair in the way your ego defines fairness. But even then, a more subtle challenge remains: the discomfort that arises when others experience joy, success, ease, especially when you are struggling. It's quiet, often unspoken, but powerful. It's the ache of jealousy, the resistance to another person's happiness when yours feels out of reach. This is the edge of the next transformation. Mudita is the practice of sympathetic joy. It is the ability to feel genuine happiness for someone else's good fortune, not just tolerate it, not just fake support, but to feel joy from their joy. It may sound simple, but it's one of the most difficult and most liberating heart practices in the Buddhist path. Because it confronts the deep conditioning of comparison, it challenges the belief that love, success, attention, and peace are scarce, that if someone else has more, you must have less. And this belief, often buried beneath awareness, creates quiet suffering. When you start to work with mudita, you begin to see how often joy for others is blocked. You catch the micro-reactions, the thought that says they didn't deserve it, the voice that says you've worked harder, the contraction in your chest when someone is praised, especially if you, 39, we've been overlooked. These are the subtle poisons of envy, not because you are a bad person, but because you are human. And unless they're seen with compassion, they stay hidden and continue to shape your emotional experience. The heart closes a little each time you reject another person's joy. Not because you intend to, but because the ego wants to protect its story. It says, "Why not me?" It says, "They're ahead." It says, "I've been forgotten." But these statements are based on illusion. There is no finish line, no fixed place on the ladder. There is only the present moment and the way you choose to meet it. Mudita teaches you that someone else's happiness is not your loss. It is not a threat. It is not a verdict about your worth. When you learn to feel joy for someone else, you soften the part of yourself that feels left out. Because you stop reinforcing the lie that your value depends on comparison, you begin to heal the root of jealousy, not by suppressing it, but by meeting it with compassion. This doesn't happen through force. You don't replace envy with fake joy. You start by being honest. You notice where the resistance is. You feel the sting without adding shame. You pause. You breathe into it. And then you practice it slowly, deliberately. You bring to mind someone who is happy, someone who has achieved something meaningful. And you whisper inwardly, "May your joy continue. May your blessings grow. May you feel peace." At first, the words may feel hollow, but that's okay. You're not trying to force a feeling. You're planting a seed. Each time you practice, the heart softens, the grip of jealousy loosens, and in its place, space begins to grow. A space where connection can return, a space where love can expand. Because the truth is, when your heart celebrates someone else's joy, you heal your own pain. You shift from scarcity to abundance. You begin to realize that joy is not limited, that the light in another person does not dim yours, that we rise together, not at each other's expense. This shift rewires the nervous system. It teaches the body that joy is safe, that opening the heart doesn't mean losing ground, that softening doesn't mean weakness. You begin to feel how closed you've been, not by choice, but by habit, and now you have a practice that opens you gently. Mudita also heals relationships. Many conflicts are not rooted in anger, but in unspoken comparison. The subtle belief that you must compete for love, for attention, for recognition. This belief creates distance. It makes it hard to trust. It turns friendship into rivalry. But when you practice rejoicing in someone's joy, you begin to dissolve that distance. You build bridges where there were once walls. You learn to love without needing to win. And this love becomes a refuge, not only for others, but for you. Because the more you celebrate joy, the more joy you feel. You no longer wait for life to give you a reason to be happy. You find happiness in the happiness of the people around you. Your well-being is no longer limited to your own achievements. It expands. It includes more. It becomes shared. This doesn't mean ignoring your pain. It means expanding your capacity, holding space for both your sadness and their success, your grief and their celebration. You become emotionally mature not by suppressing what you feel, but by including more in your awareness. This maturity creates resilience. A heart that bends but does not break. And this kind of heart is powerful. It cannot be pulled into drama. It cannot be easily offended. It doesn't need to prove anything, because it is full, not from ego, but from connection, from presence, from love that is no longer transactional. This is where mudita becomes a force not passive, but transformative. It cuts through the illusion of separation. It teaches you that joy is not a resource to be divided. It is a quality to be shared. It is a medicine that multiplies when offered freely. And as you practice more deeply, you begin to notice something else. The people you once envied, when you celebrate their happiness, they start to feel like allies. Their light reminds you of what's possible. Their growth becomes inspiration, not comparison. You shift from insecurity to solidarity. You also start to notice who you struggle to feel joy for, not as a judgment, but as insight. These are the places where your own wounds still ask to be seen. Maybe it's the sibling who always seemed favored, the friend who always had what you lacked, the stranger whose success triggers old stories of not being enough. These people are teachers, not because they did something to you, but because their happiness touches a part of you that still wants healing. You meet these moments with honesty. You pause, you feel, you breathe, you offer the words anyway. May your joy continue. May you be well. May your happiness bring peace to others. Even when it feels hard, you say the words. Not because you have to, but because you're choosing to grow. And you grow. Each time you practice mudita, you weaken the roots of jealousy. You untangle the web of comparison. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's life, and you return to what is real, this breath, this heart, this moment. Eventually, it becomes natural. You hear good news and feel uplifted. You see someone shine and your placed heart opens. You stop resisting happiness in others and, because of that, you stop resisting your own. That's the quiet secret of mudita. When you rejoice in others, you stop blocking joy in yourself. You stop feeling like an outsider. You stop punishing yourself through comparison. You become a participant in life, not a competitor. And that participation feels like peace. It feels like warmth. It feels like coming home. Not just to others, but to the part of you that always wanted to feel worthy, that always longed to be enough. That part begins to relax, because it no longer has to fight. It no longer has to prove. It can just love and be loved, without keeping score. This is the liberation mudita offers, not by changing others, but by changing your relationship with their joy. Not through effort, but through intention. Not through denial, but through truth. You practice. You stay open. You let joy move through you even when it isn't yours directly. And in doing so, you realize it was always yours to begin with. Because joy, when shared, becomes belonging, becomes healing, becomes freedom. As joy for others begins to open the heart and dissolve the grip of comparison, A new kind of strength quietly rises. It's not loud, it doesn't shine like excitement or glow like happiness, but it holds. It holds when things go wrong. It holds when things don't make sense. It holds when the world feels like it's pulling you in 100 different directions. This strength has a name in Buddhist practice: upekkha, equanimity, a calm mind in the middle of chaos, a steady heart in the storm. Equanimity is not indifference. It's not a shield to block emotion. It's not pretending you don't care. It's not cold or detached. It's the opposite. It's full presence with what is without needing to change it. It's the ability to stay grounded in the middle of pain and pleasure, loss and gain, success and failure. Not numb, not passive, but centered, aware, open. This quality is difficult to cultivate because the world teaches you to react to praise with clinging, react to blame with defense, react to success with pride, react to failure with shame. It's a constant swing, a back and forth that keeps your nervous system in high alert. You're pulled toward what feels good, pushed away from what feels bad. But in both cases, you, 39, not free. You're being moved by circumstances. Equanimity breaks that pattern. It creates space between the event and the emotional storm. It allows you to feel fully, but respond wisely. You don't stop experiencing life, you stop being ruled by it. This shift is subtle, but powerful. It changes everything, especially in the moments where things don't go your way. When you begin to work with equanimity, you start by noticing your reactivity. The fast thoughts, the tightening, the urge to fix or escape. You start asking questions. Can I stay with this feeling without trying to change it? Can I let this discomfort pass through without identifying with it? Can I care without clinging? These questions guide you toward balance. Equanimity allows you to witness your emotions without collapsing into them. You feel the grief without drowning in it. You sense the anger without acting it out. You observe the joy without grasping at it. This isn't suppression, it's maturity. You let life move through you, and in doing so, you remain whole. One of the biggest misunderstandings about equanimity is that it means detachment from love. But true. Equanimity deepens love, because when you're not clinging to the outcome, you're free to care without fear. You no longer love to control. You love to give. You don't offer support because you need recognition. You do it because your heart is steady enough to give without needing anything back. That's what makes it resilient. Equanimity is also essential in conflict. When someone criticizes you, your instinct may be to defend or attack, but equanimity lets you pause. You hear the words, you feel the sting, but you don't react from the wound. You respond from clarity. Maybe you set a boundary. Maybe you speak your truth, but you do it from a grounded place, not a triggered one. This groundedness is what creates trust in yourself and in your relationships. People feel it. They feel the steadiness in your energy. They feel that you won't crumble under pressure or explode under stress. You become a calm space in a world that moves fast. That calm is not perfection, it's practice. A daily choice to come back to presence. Equanimity also supports emotional regulation. When highs and lows no longer control your behavior, you stop swinging between extremes. You don't lose yourself in excitement. You don't spiral in despair. You start noticing the in-between, the quiet middle ground where clarity lives. This doesn't mean you don't feel deeply. It means you stop being thrown by what you feel. You learn to observe pleasure without clinging. You enjoy it, but you don't chase it. You allow it to rise and fade without making it your identity. This frees you from the constant craving for more. It brings contentment, a quiet satisfaction that doesn't need stimulation to survive. You also learn to hold pain with gentleness. You stop resisting what hurts. You allow sadness to be part of your experience without making it your whole identity. You see that even in suffering, there's something steady beneath the waves. That awareness becomes your anchor. Upekkha also teaches you to stop trying to control what you cannot. Much of your stress comes from resistance, wanting life to follow your plan. But life doesn't follow your plan. People change. Outcomes surprise you. Nothing stays fixed. Equanimity doesn't stop the change, it stops your suffering about the prudera. Change. You let go, not because you don't care, but because clinging hurts more than release. This doesn't make you passive. Equanimity doesn't mean you stop trying. It means you stop needing. You still act. You still show up. But your happiness is no longer tied to the outcome. You can give your best and let go of the rest. This is how you move through life without burning out, without collapsing from the weight of expectation. And it applies not just to the big moments, but the small ones. When you're stuck in traffic, when someone speaks harshly, when plans fall apart. Instead of reacting with frustration or blame, you pause, you breathe, you remember that this too will pass. You remember that peace is available now, not after things go your way, but right in the middle of what's happening. This is not denial. You're not pretending things are fine when they aren't. You're simply refusing to add suffering to what's already difficult. You meet the moment with presence instead of resistance. That presence opens the door to wisdom. Because when you're not reactive, you can see more clearly. You make better choices. You speak with intention. You act with integrity. You don't waste energy on things that don't matter. You focus on what does. You become less dramatic, more discerning, less chaotic, more grounded. Equanimity also supports forgiveness, not just of others, but of yourself. You stop needing to be perfect. You stop punishing yourself for past mistakes. You recognize that growth is messy, that healing takes time. You give yourself space to be human, to fall and return, to hurt and repair. You stop holding on to regret like a badge. You begin again without judgment, without shame. And with this acceptance comes freedom. You stop expecting yourself to always be in control. You trust the process. You let life unfold without rushing to fix or escape. You learn to be with what is even when it's uncomfortable. That being with becomes healing. Equanimity also deepens your spiritual practice. Meditation is no longer about reaching a certain state. It becomes a place to observe without chasing, to sit in stillness without needing peace to feel peaceful. You watch the breath, you notice the thoughts, you feel the sensations, and you don't interfere. You let it all come and go. You train the mind to stay centered no matter what arises. This steadiness becomes a gift you carry into daily life. It shows up in how you listen, in how you wait, in how you hold space for uncertainty. You stop rushing into answers. You stop needing to fix what's uncomfortable. You start trusting that clarity comes from stillness, not force. Equanimity makes your heart more spacious. It gives you room to hold joy and sorrow without being pulled apart. It helps you stay open even when things don't make sense. It lets you care deeply without losing yourself. This kind of heart is rare, and it's needed, especially in a world that moves fast and feels fragmented. You don't cultivate upekkha overnight. You return to it again and again. When emotions rise, you notice. When chaos hits, you pause. When you forget, you begin again. It's not about staying calm forever. It's about remembering that calm is always available when you return to presence. And that return is everything. It's how you shift from being thrown to being steady, from reacting blindly to responding wisely, from feeling lost to feeling whole. Not because life got easier, but because you learned how to meet it differently. This is the subtle power of equanimity. It doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand, but it stays. It breathes, it waits, it opens. And in that quiet, steady presence, you find a kind of strength that no chaos can touch, a freedom that doesn't depend on conditions, a peace that isn't shaken by the world, but becomes a refuge inside it. Even as the heart learns to stay steady in the face of life's changes, something deeper still lingers quietly. Underneath it, all the unspoken truth that everything we hold, everyone we love, even this body we call home, will one day be gone. It is the truth most people avoid at all costs, even when they sense it. But for those on the path of clarity, it is not something to fear, it is something to turn toward. Because only when you bring death into view can you truly learn how to live. This practice is called Maranasati, mindfulness of death, not as an idea, but as a daily confrontation with impermanence. Facing death does not remove fear by making you numb. It removes fear by removing illusion. It reveals how much of your emotional suffering is rooted not in the present, but in your attachment to permanence. You suffer because you think things will stay the same, or should stay the same. You cling to identities, titles, grudges, expectations, as if they have no end. But everything has an end, and the sooner you allow that to be true, the lighter you become. This isn't meant to be bleak, it's meant to be clarifying. When you reflect on death, you begin to see what truly matters. Not someday in the future, but right now. The argument that felt so important starts to lose its sharpness. The need to prove yourself softens. The pressure to be liked fades, because in the face of mortality, ego has no weight. The roles you play, the things you collect, the opinions you defend, none of it follows you. And when you see this clearly, you start letting go of what never really served you. This letting go is emotional purification. You don't have to force forgiveness when you understand that holding resentment wastes time you don't have. You don't need to prove your worth when you realize how little external validation means in the final moments. Death reveals truth without apology. And if you're willing to sit with that truth, it becomes the most honest teacher you'll ever know. Maranasati is not about thinking of death to feel despair. It's about bringing death close enough that you stop postponing your life. You stop waiting for a better mood, a better version of yourself, a better time. You start living now, fully, with awareness. Because the illusion of endless time is the foundation of procrastination, avoidance, and fear. When you see clearly that life is short, you become bold in your presence. You stop leaking energy into what doesn't matter. This clarity changes your relationships. You speak more honestly. You listen more fully. You forgive more quickly. You start valuing people not for how they make you feel, but for who they are. You don't hold back affection. You don't wait to say what needs to be said. Because the truth is, none of us know how long we have. Every interaction could be the last. And that is not meant to scare you, it's meant to wake you up. Facing mortality also brings you back into your body, not in fear, but in gratitude. You begin to treat your life as a precious, temporary gift. The breath becomes more sacred. The senses become more vivid. You feel time differently. You stop rushing through days and start honoring them, not by making them perfect, but by making them real. This shift dissolves a lot of inner noise. The worry about status, the endless planning, the comparison, the need to always be improving, all of it loses power. Not because you give up, but because you wake up. You begin to see how much suffering comes from the illusion that everything important is somewhere else, sometime later, with someone else. Maranasati pulls you back, not to fear, but to freedom. And that freedom opens the door to emotional truth. You stop pretending you have forever to heal. You start doing the work. You stop postponing the hard conversations. You start choosing peace over pride. You stop needing to be right. You start choosing connection, not because you're forced to, but because you know how precious each moment is. This awareness becomes a compass. When you have a difficult decision to make, you ask, what will matter at the end? When you face emotional turmoil, you ask, is this worth carrying? When you feel stuck in ego-based patterns, you ask, will this version of me exist when I die? The answers are often humbling. And in that humility, you become more human, more open, more real. Death contemplation also helps you release fear of change. If death is guaranteed, then every change before it is preparation. Every ending is a teacher. Every loss is a rehearsal. You start seeing life not as a line, but as a wave, rising and falling, appearing and vanishing. You stop grasping at the wave and start riding it. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only way to stay free. This practice also deepens spiritual grounding. You begin to sense what part of you is not defined by form. What part of you observes the passing of time, but does not age. You taste the part of consciousness that isn't afraid of endings, because it understands that nothing truly disappears, everything simply changes form. This doesn't remove grief, but it softens it. It brings compassion into sorrow. It adds love to goodbye. Maranasati also clears emotional clutter. You no longer need to carry every regret, every missed chance, every old version of yourself. You see how much weight you, 39, you've been holding out of habit. And one by one, you start laying it down. You stop being loyal to who you were and start being true to who you are. This is emotional purification, not through pressure, but through perspective. You don't need a crisis to start this practice. You don't need to wait for illness, loss, or aging. You can begin now, sitting quietly, breathing deeply, bringing to mind the reality that this life is temporary, that this moment is sacred, that this breath is not promised. You might feel discomfort. That's okay. Discomfort is part of the process. It means you're stepping outside the trance of permanence. You're seeing clearly, maybe for the first time. And clarity always brings some pain, but also great peace. That peace shows up in how you move through the world. You stop needing control. You stop clinging to plans. You allow life to surprise you. You appreciate more, demand less. You stop looking for security in things that fade. You find it in presence. You also become more compassionate with others, because when you know that everyone you meet will die, including you, you become softer, kinder, less reactive. You stop wasting time on drama. You don't need to make people into enemies. You see their fear, their confusion, their struggle. You see their humanity, and you meet it with yours. Death awareness is not separate from emotional healing. It is the root of it, because most emotional pain comes from holding on too tightly to roles, to resentment, to stories that no longer serve. When you reflect on death, you loosen that grip, you let things be as they are, you forgive more, not because you have to, but because you want to be free. And freedom becomes the center of your practice. You begin to live with fewer illusions. You stop waiting for perfect conditions. You start showing up fully now. You laugh more. You cry more easily. You express what matters. You live like your time means something, because it does. There is no need to fear death when you are fully alive. And being fully alive doesn't mean chasing constant joy. It means being present, being honest, being aware. It means letting your life be simple and real. And that realness is what brings peace. Maranasati brings you back to your essence, not your achievements, not your image, just the raw presence of being, the awareness that watches thoughts, the breath that carries life, the stillness underneath all emotion. That stillness is not something you create, it's what remains when you stop clinging. So you return to it each day, not out of dread, but out of devotion, not to what might be lost, but to what is here, now, alive. You give thanks, not just in words, but in action,